Eleanor Brooks pressed her bouquet so hard her knuckles went white, not from nerves, but from the furious, desperate urge not to run. She was 19 years old, standing at the altar of a church full of strangers being handed to a man she had never chosen. If you've ever felt like your life was being decided without you, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel, follow Eleanor's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. The summer of 1878 came to Copper Ridge, Texas like it always did, without mercy and without apology. The sun pressed down on the town's cracked main street before 8 in the morning, and by the time the church bells rang at 10, the heat had already turned the inside of First Methodist into something close to an oven. Eleanor Brooks stood in the narrow side room off the nave, still wearing her traveling clothes from the night before. No one had thought to find her a proper dress. Her mother had pressed a bundle of dried wildflowers into her hands that morning and called it a bouquet. Eleanor had not corrected her. She had simply looked at the brittle stems at the petals already crumbling at the edges and thought, "That's about right." She was 19 years old. She was about to marry a man she had spoken to exactly once, and that conversation had lasted less than 4 minutes. Eleanor. Her father, Thomas Brooks, appeared in the doorway. His hat was in his hands, turning the way it always did when he was about to say something he knew was wrong. "It's time." She did not look at him. "I know. I need you to understand." "I understand perfectly, Papa." Her voice was quiet, controlled. She had learned in the months since her mother's illness had stripped their savings to bone that there was a version of anger that lived so deep inside a person it stopped making noise. It simply sat there, heavy, permanent. "You owe Samuel Carter $4,000. And this is how you're paying him." Thomas flinched. "It isn't like that." "Then what is it like?" She finally turned to look at him. "Tell me. I want to hear you say it differently." He couldn't. He just kept turning his hat. Eleanor walked past him into the church. The congregation of Copper Ridge had turned out in full. Not out of warmth, Eleanor understood that immediately. They had come the way people come to watch something they can't quite believe is happening. She heard the whispers before she was halfway down the aisle. "That's the Brooks girl. Thomas Brooks's daughter." "Did you hear what he did?" "Sold her is what I heard." "Well, Carter paid the debt, so what does that make her?" She kept her chin level. She fixed her eyes on the wooden cross at the far end of the church, and she walked. Samuel Carter was standing at the altar. Eleanor had only seen him once before 3 weeks ago, when her father had brought her to Carter's ranch to make introductions, a phrase that turned her stomach even now. She had formed impressions quickly tall with the kind of broad shoulders that came from actual labor, not performance. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A jaw that looked like it had been carved out of the same limestone as the Texas hills. He was older than her. Not ancient 34, she had been told, but old enough that the distance between them felt like more than years. He had said, "Miss Brooks, I hope the ride wasn't too uncomfortable." She had said, "It was fine, thank you." And that had been the entirety of their courtship. Now she stood across from him at the altar of First Methodist Church, while Reverend Hale read from a Bible with a cracked spine. And she looked at Samuel Carter's face, and tried to find something, anything that told her who this man actually was. He was looking back at her, not with possession, not with the smug satisfaction she had braced herself for. His expression was, she couldn't name it. Careful, measured. Like a man who had decided something difficult and was holding himself to it. She looked away first. "Do you, Eleanor Ann Brooks?" Reverend Hale intoned. "Take this man." "Can I run?" The thought arrived clean and clear, the way honest thoughts do when everything else has been drowned in obligation. "I could turn around right now, walk out that door." What would they do? Chase me down the street? She already knew the answer. They wouldn't have to. Where would she go? Back to a house where her father's debt still sat on the table. Back to a mother who needed medicine that cost money they didn't have. She had no money of her own, no property, no kin beyond Copper Ridge who would take her in. She was 19 years old in 1878, and the options available to her fit inside a thimble. To be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish. "I do," Eleanor said. The words came out steady. She was proud of that at least. "And do you, Samuel James Carter?" "I do." His voice was low, unhurried, like a man who had already made his peace with it. Reverend Hale pronounced them husband and wife. Samuel Carter did not kiss her. He simply offered her his arm, formal and correct, and Eleanor placed her hand on it because the alternative was standing there alone, which felt worse. They walked back up the aisle together, while the congregation watched, some in pity, some in judgment, some in the peculiar fascination people reserve for spectacles they didn't have the courage to intervene in. She heard a woman's voice from the third pew. "Poor thing, doesn't know what she's gotten into." She heard a man answer low and satisfied. "Reckon Carter knows exactly what he's gotten." Eleanor's hand tightened on Samuel's arm without meaning to. He did not react, but he did not pull away. They rode out to the ranch in a hired wagon with Eleanor's single trunk in the back and no particular conversation between them. The road out of Copper Ridge cut through open country, flat, burnt gold grassland, broken by mesquite and the occasional dark scratch of a dry creek bed. Eleanor watched it pass and tried to think practically. That was what she had decided to do. Be practical. Do not cry. Do not rage. Assess. She assessed the ranch was called the Double C. It ran cattle, roughly 400 head on land that had been in the Carter family since the 1840s. Samuel Carter had no surviving family. His parents were gone. A brother had died at Gettysburg. He employed 6 ranch hands who lived in a bunkhouse near the east pasture. He was, by all accounts, financially solvent, privately spoken, and had never, so far as anyone in Copper Ridge could confirm, mistreated an employee or animal. That last part she had asked about specifically. "Mr. Carter." He glanced at her. "Ma'am." "I need to say something, and I'd prefer to say it now rather than let it fester." A pause. "All right. I am here because I had no other choice." She kept her voice even. "I want you to know that I understand the arrangement, and I intend to hold up my end of it. I'm not fragile, and I'm not foolish, and I won't make your life difficult if you don't make mine difficult. But I will not pretend to be content with something I did not choose. I won't perform happiness I don't feel, and I won't be—" She searched for the word. "Managed. Like I'm something that needs to be handled." The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. Then Samuel Carter said, "I wouldn't want you to pretend." She looked at him. "I didn't go into this expecting gratitude," he said, "or performance. What your father owed I've settled. What happens from here is—" He paused, choosing. "Up to us, I suppose. Both of us." Eleanor studied the side of his face. "Why did you agree to this arrangement?" Another long pause, longer than the last. "That," he said, "is a conversation for a different day." She filed that away. She was good at filing things away. The ranch house was larger than she had expected. 2 stories, solid timber construction, a covered porch that ran the full width of the front, not grand, not decorated, but built by someone who understood the land it was sitting on. Functional, enduring. It looked like the man who owned it. Vera Moss was waiting on the porch. She was a stout woman in her 50s, with iron gray hair and the directness of someone who had survived enough of life's nonsense to have lost patience with pretense. "You must be Eleanor." Vera came down the porch steps with a hand already extended. "I'm Vera. I keep the house and cook the meals and generally prevent this property from descending into ruin." "Welcome." Eleanor shook her hand. The grip was firm. "Thank you, Mrs. Moss." "Vera, Mrs. Moss was my mother-in-law, and she was a difficult woman." Vera glanced at Samuel. "I've put her in the south bedroom. It gets the best light." Samuel nodded once and carried Eleanor's trunk inside without being asked. Vera watched him go, then turned back to Eleanor with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely unfiltered. "He's a good man," she said quietly. "Complicated, but good. I want you to know that before you decide otherwise." Eleanor looked at her. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because somebody ought to." Vera shrugged. "And because you look like a young woman who's already made up her mind, and I'd hate to see you stick with a bad decision just because you made it fast." She turned toward the door. "Supper's at 6. You look like you need a meal." Eleanor stood on the porch alone for a moment, the summer heat pressing down on her bare head. The grassland stretching out in all directions, and felt for the first time since her father's knock on her bedroom door 2 months ago, something complicated that was not quite despair. She could not have named it. She went inside. The first week passed in a careful, exhausting negotiation of space. They had separate bedrooms. That had been established without discussion. She had found her room with its iron-framed bed and Vera's practical quilts and the south-facing window that did in fact let in beautiful morning light, and Samuel had his own room down the hall, and neither of them raised the subject. Eleanor was deeply grateful for that. It was the one mercy in the arrangement that felt genuine rather than transactional. They ate breakfast together because Vera served breakfast at the table, and it would have been strange not to. They were almost entirely silent at breakfast. Eleanor drank her coffee and read whatever she could find. A 3-week-old newspaper, a seed catalog, the back of a flour sack. Samuel read nothing. He sat with his cup and looked out the window toward the east pasture with the focused attention of a man running calculations no one else could see. On the third morning, he said without preamble, "Can you ride?" Eleanor looked up from the seed catalog. "Yes." "Well enough to work or just enough to stay on?" She set down the catalog. "I grew up on a small farm in Jasper County. I've been riding since I was 6. She paused. "Well enough to work." Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a small recalibration, like a man updating a map. "There's a quarter horse in the second stall. Gray mare name's Dolly. She's yours to use if you want her." Eleanor blinked. "Mine to use." "Yours," he said. "You don't need to ask permission." She hadn't expected that. She covered the fact that she hadn't expected it by picking up her coffee. "Thank you." And then they went back to silence. But it was Eleanor noticed a slightly different silence than it had been the day before. On the 5th day, she went into Copper Ridge for supplies with Vera. She had not been back since the wedding. The main street looked the same as it had that terrible morning, same dry heat, same weathered storefronts, same hitching posts. But she was not the same, or at least she was determined to present herself as not the same. She was wrong to think it would be simple. She was at the dry goods counter listing out the ranch's supply needs to old Mr. Danforth when she heard it. "That's her!" The voice came from 2 women standing near the bolts of fabric at the back of the store. They were making no particular effort to be quiet. "The Brooks girl. Carter's wife, I suppose we have to call her now." "Doesn't look like much," the second voice said. "Though I suppose Carter didn't buy her for looks." Eleanor's hand resting on the counter went completely still. Mr. Danforth's eyes flicked to her face and then quickly away. He began writing out her list very slowly, looking at his paper. "I heard Thomas Brooks had been borrowing from Carter for years," the first woman continued. "Finally just handed over the girl when he couldn't cover it, like a horse trade. Cheaper than a horse, probably." A low, pleased laugh. Eleanor turned around. The 2 women, she recognized them now, Agnes Whitfield and her sister-in-law Ruth, went quiet when they saw her looking directly at them. Not embarrassed, just quiet the way people get when they realize the subject of their entertainment has unexpectedly acquired eyes. Eleanor walked toward them. Not fast, not slow. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said. Her voice was pleasant the way a sharpened knife is pleasant-looking before you understand what it is. "I heard what you said. All of it." Agnes Whitfield's chin came up. "I wasn't speaking to you." "No," Eleanor agreed. You were speaking about me, to an audience, in public, which is actually worse. She tilted her head slightly. I grew up in Jasper County. I have 4 brothers. I have been hearing that kind of talk my whole life, and I'll tell you what I've learned about it. It says nothing useful about the person being talked about. It says quite a lot about the person doing the talking. Ruth made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sniff. Eleanor looked at her calmly. I didn't ask to be here, ma'am. I didn't choose this marriage. You're right about that. But I am here and I am Samuel Carter's wife, and I intend to conduct myself accordingly. So if you have something to say about me, I'd ask you to have the respect to say it to my face. She paused. And I'd ask you to find better material. She turned and walked back to the counter. Vera, who had appeared at her elbow at some point during this without Eleanor noticing, said very quietly, "Well done." Mr. Danforth was looking at Eleanor with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something he was going to describe at the dinner table for weeks. He cleared his throat. "I'll have everything ready within the hour, Mrs. Carter." It was the first time anyone had called her that. Eleanor picked up her list. "Thank you, Mr. Danforth." She didn't tell Samuel about what happened in the store. She didn't know why exactly. Something about the incident felt like hers, like a thing she had handled herself and therefore owned, and reporting it to him would somehow diminish the ownership. She put it away and went back to the ranch and helped Vera carry the supplies in from the wagon. That evening after supper, she was sitting on the porch with a mending basket when Samuel came out and stood at the railing with his coffee. This had become their arrangement by unspoken agreement, not together, not apart. Occupying the same space without the pressure of filling it. After a while, he said, "Vera told me what happened at Danforth's." Eleanor's needle did not pause. "I figured she might." A silence. "You could have left," he said. "Ignored them and left." "Yes." She tied off a thread. "I could have." "Why didn't you?" She considered the question. The heat had finally broken a little with the sun going down, and the air smelled like dry grass and something faint and sweet she couldn't identify. Somewhere out in the pasture, a horse moved in the dark. "Because leaving would have told them they were right," she said. "That I'm something to be whispered about, something reduced." She looked up at him. "I'm not. Whatever the circumstances of this marriage are, I am not a transaction. And I'll say so as many times as I need to." Samuel Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back to the railing and drank his coffee and said nothing. But he didn't go inside. He stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out, and Eleanor mended, and the night sounds of the ranch rose and fell around them, and it was not comfortable exactly, but it was something. A beginning of something she couldn't yet name. She was 19 years old, and she had been handed to a stranger, and the town of Copper Ridge had already decided who she was. Eleanor Brooks. Eleanor Carter, now whether she liked it or not, had decided otherwise. And somewhere in the careful, watchful silence of Samuel Carter, in the way he stayed on that porch, when he could have gone inside, she felt the first faint, unreliable suggestion that she had not been entirely wrong to stay. She told herself not to trust it. She told herself to be practical. But the summer night was warm, and the stars over Copper Ridge were extraordinary. And Eleanor Carter pressed her lips together against something that was not quite a smile, and kept mending. The thing about silence was that it had texture. Eleanor had lived in enough of it over the past 2 weeks to know the difference between the silence of a man who had nothing to say and the silence of a man who was choosing very deliberately not to say something. Samuel Carter was almost always the second kind. He carried his quiet the way other men carried a weapon close, practiced, purposeful, and it had taken her this long to stop letting it unsettle her. Almost stop. She was in the kitchen with Vera on a Tuesday morning when she first heard the ranch hands talking in the yard. Their voices carried through the open window, without shame the way voices do when men assume no one worth caring about is listening. "You seen Carter's new wife? That was Pete Grady." She'd identified the voices by now, put names to them, the way she'd always done with people she needed to understand quickly. Pete was the youngest of the 6 hands, barely 20, with the cocksure ease of someone who'd never been seriously wrong about anything yet. Hard to miss her. That was Cole, older, quieter. She's up before sunrise every morning. Saw her working the garden yesterday. Doesn't belong here, you ask me. Pete again. Carter could have married any woman in the county. Instead, he takes on some broke farmer's daughter who doesn't know the first thing about running a real ranch. My sister works harder than that woman, and she's 12. Eleanor set down her coffee cup. Vera, without looking up from her biscuit dough, said, "Don't." I wasn't going to do anything. You were going to go outside and say something to that boy that you'd feel righteous about for about 10 minutes, and then it would make the next 6 months complicated. Vera punched the dough with practiced efficiency. Let it alone. Eleanor looked at the window. Pete's voice had moved off toward the barn, the conversation drifting with it. He's not wrong, is he? She said. Not a question. Vera looked up then. About what? I don't know this ranch. I don't know cattle. I know a kitchen garden and a plow horse and how to stretch a meal for 6 people on almost nothing. She picked her cup back up. That's not the same thing. No. Vera agreed. It isn't. She went back to her dough. You going to let that stop you? Eleanor thought about it. No. Didn't figure? Vera nodded toward the back door. Cole's mending fence on the south line this morning. If you go out there and ask him to show you the property boundaries, he'll do it. Cole respects a person who asks direct. Eleanor went out the back door and saddled Dolly herself. Cole Whitmore was a lean, sun-darkened man in his 40s, who spoke the way Samuel did in short, useful sentences with no ornamentation. When Eleanor rode up to where he was working the south fence line and asked him to show her the boundary of the double C, he looked at her for a long moment with no particular expression, then said, "Yes, ma'am," and started walking. He walked her through 4 miles of property over the next 2 hours. He named the creek beds the seasonal grazing rotations, the places where the fence was reliable and the places where it wasn't. He told her which of the hands was best with horses, which with cattle, which would give her a straight answer, and which would tell her what she wanted to hear. He did all of this without commentary, without evaluation, as if informing her was simply a reasonable thing to do, because she had asked. When they got back to the barn, Eleanor said, "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. That was useful." Cole tipped his hat. "You ride well, Mrs. Carter." It was a small thing, but she held it. She was crossing back to the house when Pete Grady stepped out from behind the water trough directly into her path. Arms crossed, wearing an expression that told her this was not accidental. "You go getting a tour of the property." His voice had the quality of something deliberately light, the kind of lightness that has weight packed underneath it. Eleanor stopped walking. "I did." "Carter know you're out riding around asking questions." "I don't need Mr. Carter's permission to learn the land I'm living on." She kept her voice level. She was getting good at level. "Is there something you need, Pete?" He blinked at the use of his name. She'd surprised him. "Just wondering," he said, less sure now, "how long you're planning to play house before you get bored and go back to wherever you came from." "Jasper County," she said pleasantly. "And I'm not going anywhere." She stepped around him. "You ought to find something better to do with your time. Cole's going to need help on the south fence this afternoon." She didn't look back, but she heard him stand there for a moment with nothing to say, which was what she'd been aiming for. She was halfway up the porch steps when Samuel's voice came from the side of the house. "I heard that." She stopped, turned. He was standing at the corner of the porch, a coil of rope in one hand, and his expression was, she still couldn't fully read him, but there was something in it. Intent. "How much?" she asked. "Enough." He looked toward where Pete had been standing. "I'll speak to him. Don't." She said it quickly before she'd fully decided to. He looked at her. "I handled it," she said. "If you go speak to him on my behalf, then the story becomes that I needed you to. I'd rather it not be that story." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "You'd rather have a 20-year-old ranch hand's disrespect than accept help." "I'd rather earn my own ground than have it handed to me." She met his eyes. "You of all people should understand that." Something moved across his face. Not what she expected, not irritation, not amusement. Something that looked for just a moment like recognition. He nodded once and went back to whatever he'd been doing with the rope. Eleanor went inside and stood in the hallway for a full 30 seconds before her heartbeat slowed. She had no idea yet what to do with a man who kept making sense to her against her intentions. 3 days later, she found the papers. She had not been snooping, that was the truth, even if she suspected no one would believe her. She had been looking for a receipt. Vera needed something about a lumber order from the previous spring that the supplier was now disputing, and Vera had said it was likely in the study in the left-hand drawer of the desk under the household ledger. Eleanor had gone to find it. The left-hand drawer, the ledger, and beneath the ledger, the receipt. And beneath the receipt, folded into thirds, a document with her father's signature at the bottom. She almost put it back. She genuinely almost did. Her hand moved to fold it away, and her eyes moved with it, and then she saw the number. Not $4,000, $800. Her father owed Samuel Carter $800. She stood in the study and read the document twice slowly, while her understanding of the last 3 months rearranged itself entirely. The debt was $800. There was, as far as she could see, no language in the document that required anything beyond repayment. No arrangement. No exchange of persons. Just a loan made 4 years ago, with interest accrued for a total of $800. Eleanor sat down in Samuel's desk chair because her legs had made the decision for her. $800. Her father had told her $4,000. Had described a debt so catastrophic, so insurmountable, that this handing over his daughter was the only possible solution remaining. $800. She was still sitting there when she heard Samuel's boots on the porch. She didn't move, didn't hide the document. She sat in his chair with the paper in her hands and waited. And when he came through the front door and turned toward the study and stopped in the doorway, she looked up at him. His face went still in a way she'd never seen before. Not the controlled stillness he usually wore. Something older and more private than that. "You found it," he said. "It isn't $4,000. Her voice came out very calm. She was surprised by it. "It's $800. My father told me it was $4,000. He told me there was no other way." She set the paper on the desk. "That's not a misunderstanding. That's a lie. He lied to me about the nature of this to make sure I wouldn't argue." Samuel came into the room. He did not sit down. He stood across the desk from her with his hat in his hands, and she watched him decide something. "I know," he said. The room tilted slightly. "You know." She heard her own voice change. "You knew that my father falsified the amount to coerce me into this marriage, and you—" She stopped, started again. "Did you know before the wedding?" A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. "Samuel?" It was the first time she had used his given name. She hadn't planned it. "Did you know before the wedding?" "Yes." Eleanor stood up. It was that or stay seated, and staying seated no longer felt possible. "Then you need to explain yourself," she said very carefully. He looked at her. Then he pulled out the chair across the desk and sat down in it, and she realized that his sitting while she stood was the most significant reversal of conventional order she'd seen in a long time. "I didn't contrive it," he said. "I want to be clear about that. Your father came to me. He proposed the arrangement. I did not suggest it. But you accepted it." "I did." "Why?" Not a question. A demand. He looked at his hands for a moment. The gesture was so unlike him, so human and uncertain, that it made her chest feel strange. "Because I knew your father had been lying to you about more than the debt," he said. "Because he'd borrowed money from men in this county who are not like me. Men who don't care much about what happens to a young woman once they have an excuse to involve her in their business. He'd borrowed from Harlan Beck 2 years ago. Beck has been circling that debt ever since." Eleanor had heard the name Beck. Even in Jasper County, where she'd grown up, Harlan Beck's name existed as a kind of warning, the rancher who'd expanded his holdings across 3 counties over 20 years in ways that left broken families in his wake. If your father defaulted to Beck, Samuel said, Beck would have found a use for you that had nothing to do with marriage. He said it plainly without drama, which somehow made it land harder. I know what that looks like. I've seen it. Eleanor stood very still. You were protecting me, she said slowly, from a situation I didn't know I was in, because my father had put me in debt to a man who would have... She stopped. And you didn't tell me. I didn't know how to tell you. His voice was quiet. You came to that church believing one thing. If I'd told you the truth in that wagon ride out here, it would have... I didn't know what you'd do. I might have run, she said. Yes? And you couldn't let that happen. Not if Beck got to you first. He met her eyes. I'm not saying I handled it right. I'm saying I made the decision I thought I could live with. Eleanor stood across the desk from this man who had married her to save her from a danger she hadn't known existed, who had kept that fact to himself for 2 weeks while she resented him, who had let her resent him without defense. She didn't know what she felt. It was too large and too complicated to have a name yet. I need you to tell me everything, she said. About Beck, about my father's actual debt, about whatever else you know that concerns me, which I have apparently been the last to find out. She pulled her chair out and sat back down, and she placed her hands flat on the desk between them. All of it. Now. Samuel Carter looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. He talked for close to an hour. She did not interrupt. He told her that Harlan Beck had been buying up small farm debt across the county for 3 years, not out of honest banking interest, but because defaulted farm debt gave him leverage. He told her that Thomas Brooks had signed a secondary note with Beck 6 months ago behind the primary loan with Samuel in an attempt to cover the interest he couldn't pay. He told her that Beck had made it known through channels that weren't quite threats, but weren't quite not threats either, that he had an interest in the Brooks family's resolution, that Beck had a way of expressing interest in young women on properties he was absorbing. He's never been charged with anything, Samuel said. He's careful. But there are families in this county who have daughters who were on Beck's land when he took it, and those daughters are the families. Don't talk about them. They just... He stopped. They're quiet about it. Eleanor absorbed this. My father knew. I believe your father told himself it wouldn't come to that. Samuel's voice was even. Men who are frightened have a remarkable ability to believe what they want to believe. He handed me to you, Eleanor said, because you were the better of 2 bad choices. And he let me go thinking it was about money. I think he couldn't bear to tell you the truth. That's not the same as it being all right. No, Samuel said. It isn't. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, she could hear the ranch going on around them, the distant call of one hand to another, the movement of horses, the ordinary functional sounds of a working property. The world outside the study had not changed in the last hour. Everything inside it had. Why didn't you just pay Beck off? She said. Settle my father's debt with Beck yourself, and leave me out of it entirely. Samuel was quiet. Samuel. Because Beck wouldn't have taken the money. He looked at her steadily. He didn't want the money. He wanted the leverage. The only way to take you off the table entirely was to make you legally somebody else's, somebody he couldn't touch without a fight he wasn't willing to have. Eleanor stared at him. You married me, she said very carefully, so that Harlan Beck couldn't have me. That's the plain truth of it, he said. Yes. She didn't speak for a long moment. She looked at this man, this careful, silent, complicated man, and tried to reconcile the person she'd been building in her mind with this information, and found that they fit together in a way that was deeply, deeply unsettling. Because the man she'd been building in her mind for 2 weeks was not indifferent, was not cold, was not simply a creditor who had taken a woman as payment. He was someone who had seen a trap closing around a girl who didn't know the trap existed and had put himself in the way of it. You could have told me sooner, she said. Yes. You chose not to. I wasn't sure you'd stay. Eleanor looked at him. And if I'd known and chosen to go. The silence that followed was the most honest thing he'd ever given her. She could see him sitting with it, the real answer, the one that cost him something. Then you'd have gone, he said. It would have been your choice. I wanted the chance to. He stopped. She watched him struggle with the sentence in a way she'd never seen him struggle with anything. I wanted you to have a reason to stay, that you'd chosen yourself, not one you were handed. Eleanor's throat did something it had not done in 2 weeks. She stood up from the desk before it could finish doing it. She picked up the document, her father's signature, the real number, the real truth, and folded it back into thirds. I'm going to keep this, she said. All right. And I'm going to think. She walked to the door of the study. And you are going to give me the space to do that without hovering or explaining or apologizing. Can you do that? Yes. She stopped in the doorway, didn't turn around. Samuel. Her voice had something in it she couldn't quite contain. Were you ever going to tell me? A long pause. Yes, he said. I was. She believed him. That was the part she was going to have to think about most carefully of all. She went upstairs to her room and sat on the edge of her bed with the folded document in her hands. And for the first time since the morning her father had knocked on her door, Eleanor Carter allowed herself to cry. Not from despair, not entirely, but from the overwhelmed, furious, confusing realization that the story she'd been living was not the story she'd been told, and that the real story, the one that had been happening around her without her knowledge or consent, had been written by a man who was against every expectation she'd carried into that church, trying in his own broken and insufficient way to do right by her. She didn't forgive her father, not that night. She wasn't sure yet what she did with Samuel Carter. But she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and let herself feel it, all of it, and when she was done, she washed her face and went down to help Vera with supper. And when Samuel came to the table and sat down across from her, she met his eyes without looking away. That was all. Just that. But it was something she had chosen, and she held on to it. She did not bring it up again. Not the next morning, not the morning after that. Whatever had passed between them in the study that stripped honest hour of confession and reckoning, Eleanor folded it away the same way she had folded the document carefully into a place she could return to when she was ready. She was not ready yet. She needed time to watch him with new eyes first. So she watched. She watched the way Samuel moved through the ranch, not like a man performing authority, but like a man who understood every part of what he'd built and carried it personally. She watched him work alongside the hands instead of above them. His jacket-off sleeves rolled the same as any man on the property, except that when something needed deciding, everyone waited for him without being told to. She watched him with the horses, patient, low-voiced, deliberate. And it told her something about him she couldn't have gotten from a conversation. She watched him watch her too, though he didn't know she'd noticed. Small glances across the supper table. A pause in the yard when she came out to help Cole move supplies. Nothing aggressive, nothing claiming, just attention. The kind a person gives something they're trying to understand. On the 10th day after the study, Vera handed Eleanor a letter at breakfast, her father's handwriting. She recognized it immediately, the cramped apologetic loops of a man who'd always written like he was trying to take up less space. She set it down without opening it. You gonna read it? Vera asked. Eventually. Eleanor drank her coffee. Not this morning. Samuel across the table said nothing, but she caught the tightening around his jaw before he looked away. She read it that evening alone in her room. It was exactly what she expected, half apology, half justification, the kind of letter a person writes when they want forgiveness, without accountability. Her father explained that he had been frightened, that he had believed the arrangement with Samuel was far safer than any alternative, that he had wanted to protect her. He did not mention Beck by name. He did not acknowledge that he had lied about the amount. He wrote about his intentions as if good intentions were the same thing as good actions. Eleanor folded the letter, put it in the drawer beneath her undergarments, and went downstairs to help with the washing up. Well, Vera said. He means well, Eleanor said. He's always meant well. She picked up a dish. I'm starting to think that might be the most frustrating thing about him. Vera made a sound that was not quite a laugh and went back to work. The next morning, Harlan Beck came to the Double C. Eleanor was in the kitchen garden when she heard the horses too many for a casual call, the kind of arrival that makes the air feel different. She came around the side of the house and saw 3 riders pulling up in the yard, and the man in front was immediately recognizable, not from his appearance, but from the way everyone around him rearranged themselves. Pete stopped moving entirely. Cole straightened from what he'd been doing by the barn. Even the horses seemed to attend. Harlan Beck was somewhere near 60, broad across the chest, with a face that had once been handsome and was now something else. The same features rearranged by decades of getting what he wanted into an expression of settled, comfortable expectation. He wore his money the way some men wear a weapon, visibly, and with intent. His eyes found Eleanor immediately. "Mrs. Carter." His voice was courteous. That was the worst part, how genuinely courteous it was. I'd heard Carter had married. I'm glad to finally put a face to the name. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and came forward into the yard. She did not know exactly what Samuel had told her, what Beck was, what Beck wanted, but she knew enough. She kept her face open and neutral. "Mr. Beck." She stopped at a polite distance. "My husband isn't here just now." "That's all right, I can wait." He smiled. It reached nowhere near his eyes. "Beautiful morning for it." "It is," she agreed. "Though I'm not sure waiting is necessary. Is there something I can help you with?" Beck tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when a woman says something mildly surprising. "Neighborly visit is all. I like to know the people on the land near mine." He paused. "Your father's property, the Brooks place in Jasper County. You grew up there." Her pulse moved, but she didn't let it reach her face. "I did." "Good land, that. Jasper County's got good water." He said it the way a man says something he's thought about for a long time. "Your father holding up all right? I know he's had some difficulty." "My father is fine. Thank you for asking." She met his eyes steadily. "I'll tell Mr. Carter you stopped by. I'm sure he'll want to call on you when he's able." Beck looked at her for a moment. She had the distinct sensation of being assessed not as a person, but as a factor. A variable in a calculation she wasn't supposed to know existed. "You do that," he said pleasantly. He tipped his hat. "Mrs. Carter." He turned and rode out. His 2 men followed without a word. Eleanor stood in the yard until they were clear of the gate. Then she turned and found Cole at her elbow, and the expression on his face told her that what she'd just handled had not been nothing. "How long has he been sniffing around?" she asked. Cole's jaw worked. "Couple years." "Does Samuel know he came today?" "Ryder already went to fetch him." She nodded. "Good." She went inside. Her hands, she noticed when she got to the kitchen, were entirely steady. She was not sure if that was strength or shock. Samuel came back within the hour, riding hard enough that she heard him before she saw him. She was on the porch when he pulled up, and the look on his face when he came through the gate, controlled but barely, was the most unguarded she'd ever seen him. He was off the horse before it fully stopped. His eyes went to her first, then swept the yard in a single practiced assessment, then came back to her. "He touch you?" "No." She stood up from the porch step. "He was polite. He asked about my father's land." Samuel's mouth went flat. "He's testing." "I know." She kept her voice even. "He wanted to see if I knew anything, if I was a liability or an asset." She paused. "I think he decided I was an obstacle." Samuel came up onto the porch. He was close enough that she could see the tension in his jaw, the tightness that went all the way into his shoulders. "I should have... You couldn't have known he'd come today. He's escalating." He said it quietly, like something he'd been afraid of. "This is what he does when he decides to move on something. He comes himself first. Lets you know he's coming." Eleanor looked at him. "So what does he want?" "Still, what's left for him to want now that I'm here?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Beck bought a second note on a property 2 years ago, Farm over in Caldwell County. He took the land, and the family had a daughter. He stopped. Beck's wife died years back. He's been... Another stop. He's been acquiring things. The word hit her like cold water. Acquiring. He framed it as employment. The girl worked in his house. Samuel's eyes were steady on hers, making her hear the full weight of what he wasn't saying. She's not there anymore. Nobody talks about where she went. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. He came here today to look at me, she said slowly. Because my father's land is still in question. The Brooks property. The original debt, the real $800 that's still not fully settled, is it? Samuel's silence was confirmation enough. He thinks if he can establish some claim on my father's property, he can establish some claim on me by extension. She worked through it aloud. A married woman can't be absorbed with a land claim. But if there's any question about whether this marriage is real... Eleanor... Samuel's voice had something in it she'd never heard before. That is not going to happen. She looked at him. I know, she said. And then, because it needed to be said, I believe you. The words landed between them with more weight than she'd intended. She saw them register on his face, the careful way he received them, like something he didn't want to mishandle. I need to settle your father's debt fully, Samuel said. Publicly. I was going to, but I waited too long. If I clear it on record before Beck can use it, there's no leverage left. And Beck knows that, which is why he came today. Eleanor straightened. To see if he still had time. He doesn't. Samuel said it with a flatness that was not bravado. It was simply a fact he was declaring. I'm going into Copper Ridge tomorrow morning. That evening, Eleanor wrote her father a second letter. Not a response to his. She wasn't ready for that. This one was direct and practical. Tell no one in Jasper County that you have any dealings with Harlan Beck. If Beck contacts you, do not meet with him alone. Contact me first. She sealed it and left it on the kitchen table for the morning post. Samuel found it there when he came down before sunrise. He read the address on the envelope without comment, then looked at her. You're warning him, he said. He's still my father. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him. Whatever he did it because he was scared and didn't know a better way. That doesn't make it right, but it means he probably doesn't understand what Beck actually is. Samuel picked up his coffee. The morning was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that exists before the ranch woke up and became itself again. My father lost land when I was 12, he said without warning. Eleanor looked up from her cup. He was looking at the table, not at her. This was new. Every other conversation they'd had, he'd maintained eye contact with the consistency of a man who considered it a discipline. Didn't lose it to Beck. Different man, different time. But the same mechanics. He turned the cup in his hands. My father signed papers he didn't read well enough because he was behind on a payment, and the man who offered the note seemed reasonable. 6 months later, the land was gone. He paused. I was 12. I watched my father sit in a chair in the kitchen of a house that wasn't his anymore and not move for 2 days. Eleanor said nothing. She understood this was not a story he had told before. I swore I would never owe money to a man I didn't fully trust. He looked up finally. And I swore I would not let it happen to people I could stop it from happening to. Is that why you lent my father money in the first place? Not quite a question. Your father came to me because he'd heard I was fair. The original loan was genuine. I wasn't looking for leverage. He looked at her steadily. I didn't know about Beck until 6 months later. By then your father had already signed Beck's note behind mine. And then you made the arrangement. And then I made the arrangement, he said. Because it was the only play I had left. Eleanor looked at this man who carried his history the same way he carried everything else close, private, unseen, until he decided to show it. She thought about a 12-year-old boy watching his father dissolve in a kitchen. She thought about the way he'd said acquiring with a precision that suggested he was controlling a much stronger word. Samuel. She said his name the way she was learning to, not as a formality, but as a signal. I'm speaking to you. The actual you. Thank you for telling me. His jaw moved. You deserve to know who you're dealing with. I'm starting to think I do, she said quietly. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she looked back at her coffee, and so did he, and the morning continued around them. The ride into Copper Ridge the next day was not supposed to be eventful. Samuel had business at the land office, a formal payment on record witnessed public. Eleanor had come because she had decided somewhere in the night between his story and the morning that she would not stay at the ranch while things that concerned her happened elsewhere. She was done being managed by omission. They tied the horses outside the land office and went in together, and the clerk, a narrow man named Fitch, who wore his hair parted with mathematical precision, looked up from his desk with the arrested expression of someone who had been expecting 1 person and received 2. The transaction was quick. Samuel laid out the payment on Thomas Brooks's debt in full, the real amount documented and witnessed. Fitch stamped 3 copies. Samuel signed. Eleanor signed as witness, which Fitch had not expected, and he looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment before processing it. Recorded, Fitch said. Effective today, the Brooks note is settled in full. Thank you. Samuel folded his copy. They were 3 steps from the door when it opened inward, and Harlan Beck walked through it. The moment compressed. Eleanor felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the sky shows it. Beck stopped inside the door. His eyes moved between them with the speed of a man who understood he had just missed something important, who was measuring his loss before he'd even identified it. Carter, his voice was smooth. Didn't expect to find you in town. Beck? Samuel's voice was iron, polite iron but iron. We were just finishing up. Beck's eyes moved to the paper in Samuel's hand, then to Fitch, who was very studiously looking at his desk. Back to the paper. Land office business, Beck said. It wasn't a question. Private business, Samuel replied. Beck smiled. It was the worst kind, the smile of a man recalculating without distress, because he had other angles and he knew it. Mrs. Carter. He turned the smile on her. We meet again. Eleanor looked at him. We do. I was just telling someone last evening what a fine family the Brooks name represents. He paused. Your father's a good man. I have a great deal of respect for Thomas Brooks. She heard the message underneath it. I still have access to your father. This isn't over. She didn't look at Samuel. Whatever she said next, she wanted it to be hers. Mr. Beck, she said, her voice carrying in the small room with a clarity she felt in her sternum. I know what you do. I know how you do it. And I want you to understand that the Brooks family, my father, his land, every note he's ever signed, is not your business. Not now, and not going forward. She took 1 step toward him. Just 1, and she watched his expression shift in the smallest, most telling way. Surprise quickly covered. You will not come to our ranch again. You will not ask after my family. And if you have any business in this county that touches anything connected to Samuel Carter or Eleanor Carter, you will do it through a lawyer in writing, where everything you do is visible. She stopped. Are we clear? The room was perfectly silent. Beck looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she could not fully read, but at the bottom of it, beneath the recalculation and the careful management of his features, she saw something that might have been respect. The cold, involuntary kind. The kind men like Beck only give when they've been genuinely surprised. Well, he said softly. Carter. He glanced at Samuel. You've got quite a wife. I know it, Samuel said, quietly, without performance. Beck stepped aside from the door. They walked through it. Outside, the sun hit hard and immediate. Eleanor stood on the boardwalk for a moment, the morning crowd of Copper Ridge moving around them. People who had not heard what had just happened in the land office, who were simply living their Tuesday. She heard Samuel beside her, but didn't look at him. Eleanor. She turned. He was looking at her with something on his face that she had no precedent for, no template from the past 5 weeks to fit it against. It was open. That was the word. For the first time since the altar of First Methodist Church, Samuel Carter was looking at her without any of the careful management in place. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." She met his eyes. "I wanted to." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then his hand moved slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back. And he took hers formally the way he'd taken it at the altar. Except this time she felt the difference. This time she held on. They stood on the boardwalk of Copper Ridge's main street, the summer heat pressing down on both of them, and Mrs. Agnes Whitfield walked by on the opposite side of the road and stopped dead at the sight of them. Eleanor Carter in her ranch clothes, standing in the open street, holding her husband's hand like it was something she had decided to do. Eleanor looked directly at Agnes Whitfield. Agnes looked away first, and Samuel Carter said nothing at all. He simply didn't let go. They didn't talk about it on the ride home. Not the land office, not Beck, not the hand-holding on the boardwalk of Copper Ridge's main street in front of Agnes Whitfield and whoever else had been watching. They rode side by side through the summer heat with the kind of silence that had changed quality entirely from the silences of 3 weeks ago. No longer the silence of two strangers managing discomfort, but something closer to the silence of two people who have said enough true things to each other that the quiet between them has earned its rest. It was Vera who broke it in her way. She was waiting on the porch when they rode in, arms crossed expression, carrying the controlled satisfaction of a woman who had been right about something for a long time and was finally watching the evidence arrive. "Fitch at the land office has a loud voice," she said by way of greeting. "His wife was at the dry goods counter when I was there this morning. She had some things to say." Samuel handed off his horse to Pete, who had been considerably quieter in recent days, and came up the porch steps. "What kind of things?" "The impressed kind." Vera looked at Eleanor. "Both of you." Eleanor felt the heat rise in her face and was irritated by it. "It wasn't a performance." "No," Vera agreed. "That's why it impressed people." She held the door open. "Supper's early. You both look like you need feeding." That night, for the first time since Eleanor had come to the Double C supper, felt different. Not dramatic, nothing so obvious as that. Just different in the way of a room where the furniture has been moved slightly, where everything is in an almost right position that your body keeps adjusting to. Samuel passed the bread without being asked. Eleanor refilled his coffee without thinking about it. Vera watched all of this with the studious non-expression of a woman pretending to be very interested in her biscuit. Later on the porch, Samuel said, "Beck will regroup." "I know." Eleanor rocked once in the chair she'd claimed as hers over the past weeks. "What does regroup look like for a man like him? He'll find another angle." Samuel leaned against the railing facing her. "He won't come back directly. That's not how he works. He lost face today, and he knows it, which means he'll come at something sideways." A pause. "Your father's land is still technically in Thomas's name. The debt to me is cleared, but there's nothing stopping Beck from approaching Thomas again with a new offer." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "My father will say no." "Will he?" The question landed the way honest questions do, not cruelly, but squarely. Eleanor looked at her hands. "He should," she said carefully. "He knows better now. I wrote him." "Writing and knowing aren't always the same as doing," Samuel said. "Not as judgment, just as fact." She knew he was right. She also knew the answer, and it sat in her chest like a stone. "I need to go see him," she said. Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I know. I'm not asking permission. I know that too." The corner of his mouth moved in the near dark barely, but she caught it. "I was going to offer to come with you, if you wanted." Eleanor looked at him. In the 6 weeks since their wedding, Samuel Carter had offered her things in exactly this way, quietly sidelong, with a complete absence of pressure. The horse, the property tour, and now this. Always with the door open and no one blocking the exit. "Let me think about it," she said. Of course. She thought about it for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, she knocked on the study door and said, "Yes, I'd like you to come with me." Samuel looked up from his ledger. "All right," he said. "We'll go Friday." They arrived in Jasper County on a Friday afternoon, and Eleanor's mother was the one who met them at the gate. Martha Brooks was a small woman who had once been something close to beautiful, and was now simply worn, not broken, but used by life in the way good tools are used down to the essential functional thing. She took one look at Eleanor and pulled her in close without a word, and Eleanor pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and breathed for the first time in what felt like 6 weeks. "You look well," her mother said, pulling back to study her face. "Different." "I am different," Eleanor said. Martha's eyes moved to Samuel, standing at a respectful distance, with his hat in his hands. Her assessment was quick and complete the way mothers' assessments are. "Mr. Carter," she said, "come inside." Thomas Brooks was in the kitchen. He was smaller than Eleanor remembered, or perhaps she had grown in a way that made him look smaller. He stood up when she came through the door, and she saw the guilt on his face, immediately not concealed, not managed, just sitting there raw and exposed, the way guilt looks when a person has been alone with it long enough. "Eleanor," he started. "Sit down, Papa." She pulled out her own chair and sat across from him. "I'm not here to punish you. I'm here because we need to talk about Harlan Beck, and I need you to listen to all of it." Thomas sat. She talked for 40 minutes. She laid out everything. The real debt amount. What Beck was. What Beck wanted. What Beck had done to other families and other daughters. What had nearly happened before Samuel had moved to prevent it. She said it plainly without cruelty, but without softening either. Her father deserved the full weight of what he'd set in motion, even if he hadn't understood what he was setting in motion. Thomas Brooks went pale within the first 10 minutes. By the end, he was looking at the table with the expression of a man confronting himself from the outside for the first time and not recognizing what he saw. "I didn't know what Beck was," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I knew he was hard, but I didn't—" "You didn't ask," Eleanor said. "You were frightened, and you made decisions without asking the right questions. I understand that. But you need to understand that those decisions had consequences that went beyond the money." She stopped. "Beck approached you about the land. When—" Thomas's eyes went to Samuel, who was standing near the door, with his arms loose at his sides. Then back to Eleanor. "3 weeks ago," Thomas said. The air in the room changed. Eleanor felt Samuel go very still across the room. She kept her eyes on her father. "What did he offer? Cash payment, above market value." Thomas pressed his hands flat on the table. "I told him I needed time to think. You didn't write to me." "I was going to." "Papa," she said it quietly. "Beck came to you 3 weeks ago and you didn't write to me. He came to our ranch 2 weeks ago and tested me directly. And last week, Samuel settled your debt on record at the Copper Ridge Land Office." She looked at him steadily. "If we had been 2 weeks slower, would you have taken his offer?" Thomas's silence was the most honest thing he'd said since she walked in. Eleanor stood up. She pressed her palms on the table the way she'd learned to do when she needed to keep her voice even. The pressure helped. "Tell me you will not sell this land to Harlan Beck," she said. "Tell me that directly." "I won't." Thomas looked up at her. His eyes were wet. "I swear to you, Eleanor, I won't." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she straightened. "Good," she said, "because Samuel is going to make you a fair offer for a partnership in the South Pasture. Grazing rights, shared water on his terms, and that will put the Brooks property in a legal arrangement that Beck cannot touch without coming through the double C first." She glanced at Samuel, who had not moved, whose expression said clearly that he had not known she was going to say this. "That was what I was thinking about for 3 days," she told him. "Whether you'd agree to it." Samuel looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Thomas Brooks. Then he turned his hat once in his hands and said, "Those are good terms." Thomas put his face in his hands. The sound that came out of him was the sound of a man who had expected punishment and received something he didn't deserve. Eleanor stood and watched her father cry, and felt an ache that was not forgiveness. Yet forgiveness was a longer process she was learning, and couldn't be forced, but was something in the same country as it. Her mother appeared in the doorway with a coffee pot and the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been listening to everything and processing it faster than anyone in the room. She filled 4 cups without comment and sat down at the table. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," Martha said to Samuel, directly without preamble. "For my daughter." Samuel met Martha Brooks's eyes. "She doesn't need thanking on her behalf," he said. "She's been managing herself since the first morning." Martha looked at Eleanor with an expression that said many things, none of which required words. They stayed overnight. Samuel slept in the barn without complaint. Eleanor slept in her childhood room for the first time in 6 weeks and found that it felt simultaneously familiar and entirely too small, as if she had expanded in some way that the room could no longer contain. She lay awake for an hour, thinking about that. On the road back to Copper Ridge the next day, Samuel said, "The partnership offer. You thought that through on your own?" "Yes." Eleanor watched the road ahead of them. "You could have asked me." "I knew you'd say yes." A pause. "You were that certain." "You married me to protect my family from a predatory land deal." She glanced at him. "A legitimate partnership to keep the same land out of Beck's hands seemed consistent with your pattern." The corner of his mouth moved. "My pattern? You have one." She turned back to the road. "You don't like injustice. You don't like people using leverage against people who can't fight back. You're not especially comfortable talking about it, which means you grew up in a house where having values was private." She paused. "Did I get that wrong?" Samuel rode for a moment. "No," he said. "You didn't get it wrong." "I've been watching you," she said, "since the study, since you told me about your father." "I noticed." "You didn't mind." He considered the question with his usual care. "I found I didn't," he said. "No." She let that sit between them without pressing it, and the road unwound through the summer country, and she thought about how much had changed in 6 weeks, and how much she hadn't expected to feel about any of it. They were an hour from Copper Ridge when they saw the smoke. Samuel saw it first. His body changed before he said anything, a tightening, a shift of attention she recognized now as his version of alarm. She followed his gaze east and saw the dark column rising against the afternoon sky. "That's the Marsh property," he said. "The Marsh." She searched her new knowledge of the county. "Old Widow Marsh. She's 3 miles east of your south fence line." 2.5. He was already turning his horse. "Come on." They rode hard. The Marsh barn was fully engaged by the time they arrived. Not accidental was Eleanor's immediate assessment, and Samuel's expression confirmed it. A fire that starts by accident has a quality of randomness to it. This fire had started in 3 separate places. She could see it in the burn pattern from where they pulled up in the way the structure was collapsing. Clara Marsh was a woman in her 70s, sharp-eyed and straight-backed, despite her age, and she was standing 50 yards from the fire watching it, with her arms wrapped around herself and an expression that was not grief, but fury. "Mrs. Marsh." Samuel was off his horse and at her side in seconds. "Are you hurt?" "I am not hurt." Her voice was clipped and iron-edged. "My barn is a different story. Anyone inside animals? I got the horses out. The chickens are gone." She turned to look at him. "It was set, Samuel. Don't tell me it wasn't." "I won't," he said. "Did you see who—" "2 men. Didn't know their faces. Rode off east." She paused, and the word hung between them before she said it. Beck's direction. Eleanor, standing behind Samuel, felt the information arrive in her chest like a fist. Samuel's face went very still. "How long ago?" 20 minutes before I saw the smoke." He turned to Eleanor. His eyes were doing the calculation she could see him running. "Go to the ranch," he said. "Get Cole and 2 of the other men and come back here. Bring water barrels. And you, I'm going to stay with Mrs. Marsh." Eleanor looked at him. She looked at Clara Marsh, who was watching this exchange with the assessing eyes of someone learning something. Then she looked back at the smoke. "Beck is sending a message," she said quietly. Yes. The partnership offer we made to my father if word got out. It would have gotten out by now. Samuel's voice was tight. Someone in Jasper County talks. Beck knows the land is moving out of reach. This is... He stopped. Go, please. She went. She rode hard, and she thought harder, and by the time she reached the double C and was in the yard calling for Cole, she had assembled the shape of what Beck was doing. He couldn't touch the Brooks land now. He couldn't touch the Carters. But Clara Marsh was 70 years old alone on a ranch that had been in her family for 30 years, with no sons and no husband, and no one to stand between her and a man who wanted her water rights and had just demonstrated what happened to people who couldn't protect themselves. Cole read her face before she finished explaining. How many men does he need? 4. With barrels. Now. They were moving in under 3 minutes. When they got back to the Marsh property, the barn was mostly gone, but the house was untouched. Samuel had put himself between Mrs. Marsh and the structural collapse with the single-minded intention of a man who had decided something could not happen on his watch. He looked up when Eleanor and the hands rode in, and something in his face released almost imperceptibly, but she saw it. They spent 2 hours managing the aftermath. Cole organized the men with an efficiency that needed no supervision. Eleanor stayed with Clara Marsh, who did not need comforting, but needed someone to be furious at without it being the wrong person. I've been on this land since 1849, Clara said, watching the smoke thin. My husband built that barn the year our first son was born. I will not be moved. No. Eleanor agreed. You won't. Clara looked at her sideways. You're nothing like I expected, you know. When I heard Carter had taken a bride, I expected... She made a dismissive gesture. Someone quieter. I've been told that before. It's a compliment. Clara's jaw was set. I'm going to need some help in the short term. Hands I can trust. Carter will know who. He will. Eleanor paused. Mrs. Marsh, the water rights on your east field, who knows about those? Clara's eyes sharpened. Beck does. That's what this is about. Eleanor kept her voice level. He can't get to the Brooks land. He can't get to us, so he's going for the next best pressure point. She looked at the older woman directly. We should talk about a legal arrangement. Something on record. The same kind we've put in place for my family's property. Clara studied her for a long moment. You're suggesting I put my land under Carter's protection. I'm suggesting you put it in an arrangement that makes Beck's interference a legal matter instead of a personal one. Eleanor met her gaze. There's a difference. Yes. Clara was quiet. There is. Another pause. All right, Mrs. Carter. Let's talk. When Samuel came to find Eleanor an hour later, she was sitting on Clara Marsh's porch steps with a piece of paper covered in notes, and Clara was beside her with the expression of a woman who had made a decision and felt better for it. Samuel looked at the paper, looked at Clara, looked at Eleanor. I've been busy, Eleanor said. He sat down on the step below hers, which put him at eye level with her in a way that was entirely impractical and entirely characteristic of him, and he read the notes she handed him without comment. Then he said, This is good. I know. Beck is going to be very unhappy. Good, said Clara Marsh firmly. Samuel handed the paper back to Eleanor, and his hand lingered near hers for a moment, not touching, not quite, just present. The way he did things, quietly with intention, giving her every opportunity to decide. She turned her hand over. He took it. Clara Marsh looked out at her burned barn and said nothing, because she was a woman of great experience, and she knew better than to interrupt the right moment with the wrong word. The sun was going down over Jasper County, and what had started as a threat had become in the space of a few hours something different. The quiet, stubborn beginning of a network of people who had decided together that what Beck had been doing in this county was finished. Not through law alone, not through money alone, but through the more durable force of people choosing one by one to stand in each other's way. Eleanor held Samuel's hand on Clara Marsh's porch steps as the last of the smoke faded. She had come to Copper Ridge 6 weeks ago with a wilted bouquet and no choices, and a fury she didn't know what to do with. She was beginning to understand what to do with it. The papers for Clara Marsh's land arrangement were filed at the Copper Ridge Land Office on a Monday morning, and by Monday afternoon the news had moved through the county, the way news always moves through small places faster than wind, and with considerably more editorial embellishment. Eleanor heard 3 different versions of it before supper. The most dramatic had her standing on a courthouse step delivering a speech that reduced Harlan Beck to tears. The most understated had her and Samuel simply signing papers in a quiet room. The truth was somewhere between, but the truth mattered less, she was learning, than what people decided the truth meant. And what Copper Ridge had decided was this: the Carters were not people you moved against without consequence. She was in the kitchen with Vera when Cole came to the back door with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had decided something was worth saying, even though he'd rather not. "Mrs. Carter." He looked at her directly. "I owe you an apology." Eleanor set down her coffee. "For what?" "For Pete's talk in the yard. First week you were here." His jaw was tight with the discomfort of a man unaccustomed to this particular exercise. "I heard it, and I didn't say anything. I should have." "Cole, I figured you for temporary," he said. "Figured Carter had made a mistake and it'd resolve itself. I didn't give you a fair look." He met her eyes. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Eleanor looked at this lean, sun-weathered man who had walked her 4 miles of property boundary on her 3rd day at the ranch and answered every question she'd asked without condescension, who had read her face in the yard and organized 4 men and 3 water barrels in under 3 minutes. "You showed me the land when I asked," she said. "That was a fair look when it mattered." She picked up her coffee. "We're all right, Cole." Something shifted in his face, relief, but the dignified kind. He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." He was gone before she could say anything else. Vera, from her place at the stove, said without turning around, "He's been working up to that for 2 weeks." "I know," Eleanor said. "Pete's been working up to something too. He's just not there yet." "He'll get there," Eleanor said. "Or he won't. That's his business." "That's—" Vera turned around and looked at her with the expression she wore when Eleanor had said something that confirmed a long-held opinion. She didn't say what the opinion was. She didn't have to. "So," Beck's response came not through fire this time, but through law. Samuel found out on a Wednesday from the county sheriff, a measured man named Aldridge, who delivered information the way doctors deliver diagnoses, carefully and without drama, that Beck had filed a complaint with the district court claiming the Marsh land arrangement was fraudulent, arguing that Clara Marsh had signed under duress and that the Carter involvement represented illegal coercion of an elderly widow. Samuel came home with that information in his face before he said a word about it, and Eleanor saw it the moment he walked through the door. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He's doing it publicly this time." "Yes, because what we did is public," she was already thinking. "He can't burn anything down this time without it being obvious who did the burning. So, he's using the courts. Which means—" She stopped. "Samuel, who is the district judge?" "Harlan Pruitt." Samuel's voice was even. "He's been on the bench 11 years. Is he Beck's man?" A pause that lasted exactly long enough. "I don't know for certain." "That's not a no." "No," he said. "It isn't." Eleanor sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up and went to the study, and Samuel followed, and she stood at the desk with her hands flat on the surface the way she did when she was organizing her thinking out loud. "Clara needs to speak for herself," she said. "In court. Not through us, not through a lawyer alone. Beck is claiming she signed under duress the most effective argument against. That is Clara Marsh standing in front of a judge and telling him exactly what she thinks of that claim in her own words. Clara is not afraid of courtrooms," Samuel said carefully. "I know. But does she know we'll stand behind her if she does? Does she know you will, you mean?" He said it without irony, just fact. Eleanor looked at him. "Will you go with me to tell her?" "I'll have the horses ready in 20 minutes," he said. Clara Marsh received the news about Beck's legal filing with exactly the reaction Eleanor had predicted. Not fear, but a focused personal anger of the kind that had probably been building in the woman for 2 years. "He is calling me a confused old woman," Clara said. "In a legal document, with his name on it." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He is. I have been managing this property since my husband died in 1871. Clara's voice had the quality of iron being heated, not breaking, but changing state. "I have negotiated water rights, land boundaries, crop agreements, and livestock sales for 7 years without a man's guidance or signature. And Harlan Beck is telling a judge I can't be trusted to sign my own name without being manipulated." "Yes," Eleanor said again, "which is why you need to tell the judge that yourself." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "You're not asking me to be fragile." "I would never," Eleanor said. "I'm asking you to be exactly what you are." Clara straightened in her chair. "When is the hearing?" 2 weeks, Samuel said. "Then we have 2 weeks." Clara set her cup down with a definitive sound. "Mrs. Carter, I assume you have some thoughts about preparation." "Several," Eleanor said. "Starting with who else in this county Beck has pressured in the last 3 years, because I suspect you are not the only one, and a judge is harder to ignore when more than one person is standing in his courtroom." The silence that followed was the productive kind. The next 10 days were the busiest of Eleanor's life, and she did not have time to be frightened, which she later understood was the point. She had kept herself moving too fast for doubt to find purchase. She rode to 4 properties in 3 counties. She sat in 4 kitchens with 4 different families. 2 farm widows, a retired schoolteacher named Horace Banks, who had lost a water access agreement to Beck 18 months ago, and a young couple named Ridley, who had defaulted on a Beck note and signed away grazing rights under circumstances that Horace Banks, who had been present, described as pressure applied so thick you could cut it. None of them had spoken about it before. Each of them, when Eleanor sat across from them and laid out simply what she knew and what was happening in the district court, made the same progression: disbelief that someone was asking, followed by anger that had been waiting for somewhere to go, followed by the specific luminous relief of a person who has been alone with something too heavy and has just been offered help carrying it. She did not promise them anything she couldn't deliver. She was careful about that. She said, "Here is what we know, here is what we're doing, here is what your presence would mean." She said, "You are not obligated, and no one will think less of you if you don't come." She said, "But if you're willing, you won't be standing alone." All 4 said yes. Samuel rode with her to 3 of the 4 properties. On the road back from the Ridley farm, the 4th and final visit, he said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" "Talk to people until they trust you." Eleanor thought about it. "My mother," she said. "She was the person in Jasper County that people came to when they needed something said clearly and kindly at the same time. I used to watch her do it." She paused. "I didn't realize I'd been learning." Samuel rode in silence for a moment. "She knows what she raised," he said. Eleanor felt something move in her chest. She didn't respond immediately because the thing that had moved needed a moment to settle. "Samuel," she said. "Yes, after this is over." She stopped. Started again. "I've been thinking about what comes after. Not Beck, not the court. Just what comes after for us." She kept her eyes on the road. "I'd like to know what you want. From this, from—" She made a slight gesture that included both of them, the road, the ranch they were riding toward. "From whatever this is becoming." The pause he gave her this time was different from his usual pauses. It was not careful. It was, she could hear it, real. The pause of a man deciding not to manage his answer for the first time. "I want it to be real," he said. "All of it. Not an arrangement. Not a contract." He glanced at her, then back to the road. "I know how it started. I know what I can't undo about how it started. But I want, if you're willing, I want it to be a choice. A real one. Yours." Eleanor looked at the road ahead of them. The sun was going down behind them, throwing their shadows long on the summer dry ground. "I'm already making it," she said quietly. "I've been making it for 3 weeks. I just needed you to ask." She heard him exhale. Just once. The sound a person makes when something they have been holding for a long time is finally set down. "Eleanor." His voice had something in it she'd never heard, unguarded, direct, with none of the usual careful management. "Don't," she said, but gently. "Not yet. Let's finish what we started first. Then you can say whatever you're going to say." "You're sure?" She looked at him sideways. "I'll be more able to hear it when Beck isn't in the room." The corner of his mouth pulled up, not a near smile this time, an actual one, brief and undefended and entirely genuine. She looked away before he could see what it did to her face. The hearing was on a Thursday, and the district courtroom of Copper Ridge was not built for the number of people who came. Eleanor had not told people to come. She had told 4 families about the hearing, had described it plainly, had not asked anyone to appear as audience. But Copper Ridge was a small county, and word had moved the way it always moved. And when she and Samuel and Clara Marsh arrived at the courthouse at 9 in the morning, there were people on the steps. Not a crowd, not theater, just people. Horace Banks in his good coat. The Ridleys, the wife with her baby on her hip. 2 of the farm widows Eleanor had spoken to, standing together in quiet solidarity. Some faces she recognized from the dry goods store, the church, the Main Street people who had watched over the past 6 weeks, the series of things that had happened, and had drawn their own conclusions. Beck was already inside with his lawyer, a city man who wore his suit like a shield and spoke in long, smooth sentences designed to make simple things sound complicated. Clara Marsh walked into that courtroom with her back straight and her chin up, and the air of a woman who had decided exactly where she stood and had no intention of being moved. Judge Pruitt was a man of 60, with careful eyes that Eleanor watched closely as the proceedings began. Beck's lawyer built his case with professional efficiency: elderly widow, confusing documents, powerful neighbor, undue influence. He used the word vulnerable 4 times. Each time he used it, Clara Marsh's jaw tightened visibly. When it was Clara's turn to speak, she stood without assistance and faced the judge directly. "Your Honor," she said, "I am 71 years old. I have been managing my own affairs for 30 years. I can read, I can calculate, and I can recognize a fair contract when it is placed before me." Her voice was steady and clear as a courthouse bell. "The agreement I signed with the Carters was read to me in full disgust for 2 hours, and signed by me, of my own free will, on my own property, with no one present but myself and Mrs. Carter. There was no duress. There was no confusion." She paused. "What there was? Your Honor, was the first honest arrangement offered to me in 2 years. The pressure I have been under has not come from the Carters. It has come from Mr. Beck, and I would be very glad to describe the specific nature of that pressure in detail if the court would like to hear it." The courtroom was very quiet. Judge Pruitt looked at Clara Marsh for a long moment. Then he looked at Beck. Then he looked at Eleanor, which she had not expected, and his gaze was assessing, she thought, the way Vera had assessed her on the first day, trying to take the measure of something. "Mrs. Marsh," the judge said, "I would like to hear it in detail." Beck's lawyer half rose. "Objection?" "Sit down, Mr. Holt." Pruitt's voice was quiet. "This is my courtroom." Clara talked for 20 minutes. She was precise. She was devastating. She named dates and amounts and specific conversations and the names of the men Beck had sent to approach her before the fire, whose faces she had memorized and whose horses she had identified afterward by their markings. She described the fire. She described what she had seen of how Beck operated across the county, drawing on 30 years of neighborhood knowledge that no city lawyer and no purchased influence could manufacture. When she finished, the courtroom was not quiet in the way of emptiness. It was quiet in the way of a room full of people who have all had the same thought at the same time. Horace Banks in the second row cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said without standing, "if the court is taking testimony, I have some." "So do I," said one of the farm widows. Mrs. Ridley shifted her baby to her other hip and said nothing, but she raised her hand. Judge Pruitt looked at the room. He was a careful man, and he had been on this bench for 11 years, and Eleanor watched him make a calculation that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the weight of what was in front of him. "Mr. Beck," the judge said slowly, "I'm going to deny your filing. The Marsh-Carter arrangement stands as recorded." He set his papers down with the deliberateness of a man making a point through gesture. "Furthermore, I am recommending that the county sheriff open an inquiry into the origin of the fire at the Marsh property. That inquiry will include a review of Mr. Beck's property acquisitions over the past 5 years. He looked at Beck directly. "Am I making myself clear?" Beck sat very still. His lawyer was writing furiously on a pad of paper. "Crystal, Your Honor," Beck said. His voice was smooth, but his face had gone the color of old plaster, and Eleanor, watching from the gallery, saw the precise moment Harlan Beck understood that the county he had been treating as a private hunting ground for the past 5 years had just closed. She felt Samuel's hand find hers under the bench. She held on. Outside the courthouse in the summer heat of Copper Ridge's Main Street, with people moving around them, and Horace Banks shaking Samuel's hand, and Clara Marsh accepting the firm embrace of the 2 farm widows, Eleanor stood for a moment and simply breathed. She was aware of everything: the heat, the noise, the extraordinary ordinary feeling of the world continuing around an event that had felt from the inside enormous. She was aware of Samuel beside her, not touching her now, giving her the air she needed to process in, because he had learned her the way she had learned him, in increments with attention, without forcing. "Eleanor!" That was Pete Grady's voice, and she turned in surprise because she had not known he was there. He was standing at the edge of the group with his hat in his hands, and his face had the look of a young man who has watched something that required revising several of his previous conclusions. "Pete," she said, "I wanted to—" He stopped, tried again. "I said some things, early on, that I shouldn't have said." "Yes," she agreed. "I was wrong about you." He said it plainly without decorating it. "I wanted you to know I know that." Eleanor looked at this young man, who had decided he was entitled to judge her before she'd been on the property a week, and who was standing in front of her now with the particular discomfort of someone doing a thing they knew was right and wasn't sure they'd be well received for. "I appreciate that, Pete," she said, genuinely. He nodded, looked at Samuel. "Good hearing, boss. You were here," Samuel said. "Yes, sir." Pete put his hat back on. "Figured I ought to see it." He walked off without further ceremony. Vera appeared at Eleanor's elbow from nowhere, which was Vera's consistent mode of arrival. "He rode in at 8 this morning," she said. "Didn't tell anyone." Eleanor watched him go. "Good," she said softly. Clara Marsh made her way through the small crowd to where they were standing and took Eleanor's hand in both of hers, not a gentle hold, a grip. "Come to supper Sunday," Clara said. "Both of you. I want to talk about the water rights on the East Field, and I want to do it over food like a civilized person." "We'll be there," Samuel said. Clara held Eleanor's gaze for one more moment. "You're good for this county," she said. "I want you to know I think that." "We both are," Eleanor said. Clara looked between them and smiled small, real, the smile of a woman who had seen enough of life to know the genuine article when it was standing in front of her. "Yes," she said. "You are." She walked away. The crowd was thinning. The ordinary sounds of the main street reassembled themselves around the extraordinary morning: a horse, a shop door, someone calling a name 2 storefronts down. The summer heat pressed on with no regard for what had just happened. Samuel stood beside Eleanor and said nothing for a moment. Then, "I was going to say it on the road." She turned to look at him. "I know. I'll say it now if you'll let me." He looked at her directly the way he did when he was not managing anything. "You came to this marriage with nothing you'd chosen. No say, no preparation, no reason to stay. And you stayed. You built something, the partnership with your father Marsh's arrangement today." He stopped. "I did not deserve for any of that to happen. I made choices I thought were right, and they cost you something I can't pay back. But I want—" His voice was very quiet now, just for her. "I want to spend a long time making it worth what it cost you, if you'll let me try." Eleanor looked at this man, this careful, private, complicated man who had walked into a trap she hadn't seen and put himself in the way of it, who had sat in his own desk chair while she stood over him demanding answers, who had taken her hand on the boardwalk and not let go, who had been from the beginning trying to do right by her in the only ways he knew how. She had been handed to him like a debt payment. She was choosing him now. "You're already trying," she said. "You have been for 8 weeks. I've been watching." She stepped forward slightly, closing the distance between them to something that was no longer careful or managed or provisional. "Samuel, I'm not going anywhere. I want you to believe that." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'm starting to," he said. "Start faster," she said, and the thing that had been pressing at the corner of her mouth for weeks finally arrived, a full, real smile unheld. He reached up and touched her face. Slowly, the way he did everything, giving her time to decide. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, and she felt it all the way through. "Eleanor Carter," he said quietly, like he was confirming something. "That's me," she said. "I chose it." He kissed her there on the main street of Copper Ridge on a Thursday morning in the full August heat. And it was not a grand gesture, and it was not a performance. It was simply two people deciding finally, with the whole town watching, that they had nothing left to hide. Agnes Whitfield walked by on the opposite side of the road and stopped. And for once, Eleanor didn't look at her, and Agnes after a moment walked on. Some things don't need an audience. Some things don't need an explanation. Eleanor Brooks had been brought to Copper Ridge with wilted flowers in her hands and fury in her chest, and no choices she'd made for herself. She had made them since every single one, from the first morning she'd saddled Dolly without asking to the 4 kitchens in 3 counties, to the courtroom that morning, to this. She had not been rescued. She had not been saved. She had been given ground to stand on, and she had stood on it, and she had built something on it that belonged entirely to her. That was the thing no one could hand you, and no one could take away. Not Beck, not a bad marriage, not a frightened father, not a town that had already decided who you were before you'd opened your mouth. The thing you built by choosing every day to know your own worth and act accordingly. Eleanor Carter had learned that at 19 in the worst summer of her life, and she intended to know it for the rest of it.